I've written 5 books on the Men in Black, and the most recent one came out just about 6 weeks ago, called The Black Diary, and it's called that because it's sort of written in like a day-to-day journal style of all the sort of weird stuff that I investigated over the course of about 3 years. Now, there are sort of 2 aspects to the Men in Black mystery. One is, you know, the idea that some of these MIB are from the government, you know, sort of paralleling the Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones movies, you know. And then you have this sort of weirder side of the Men in Black, where they're sort of strange-looking, creepy, just don't actually come across as even looking completely human. Now, most people, if you mention the Men in Black, and this does sort of go back to the movies, certainly to the 90s, people think, you know, for the general public at least, you know, they take the view that, well, if there are Men in Black, they're from the government. And that is actually, or has been, you know, the overriding conclusion of many people in ufology as well. But what I've found, you know, when you, I'm sure it's like you know, you write a book and you get feedback from your readers on the relevant things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's the same with me. But what I found is that the vast majority of all the reports I get fall into this stranger category. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that by giving you some sort of historical background. Now, there were 1 or 2 MIB cases in 1947, probably the most prominent in the Maury Island case of June 47, when one of a very controversial case, as you know.
Oh, yes.
And one of the witnesses, Harold Dahl, claimed that he'd been visited by a man in a black suit who warned him not to take his investigations into this particular case any further. But it wasn't really kind of elaborated upon to the point where we could say, you know, what did the guy look like, etc., etc. But that all changed in 1951 with a guy named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he had a deep interest in the paranormal, the supernatural, the occult, and he was also had a big passion for sci-fi and horror movies. And he lived in this sort of creepy old house in Bridgeport, and he actually lived in the attic. He rented the attic off his father. And Bender was not someone who was like a dabbler, so to speak. He was very learned in the occult and the supernatural, and performed all sorts of bizarre rituals and rites. And at the height of this, he said that one particular night he was sitting on the bed when he started to feel kind of sick and lightheaded, and his head started to spin. So he lay down, and he said that he saw these 3 shadowy figures. Now, bear in mind, this is Bender's claim. He said he saw these 3 shadowy figures literally materialize through the bedroom wall, and they were almost like what people today call the shadow people, like a shadowy figure, but dressed in a black suit and a black fedora with these sort of shining eyes. And, you know, sounds like something straight out of like an H.P. Lovecraft story. Mm-hmm. And reportedly, they conversed with him via like telepathy and warned him to stay away from the UFO subject or else.
Yes, wasn't it the case that he was publishing some kind of publication on the flying saucer phenomenon, which is, as it was called back then? And my understanding, at least from what I recall researching, is that it was getting a little bit of attention. I don't know how much in the early 1950s, but for a publication, a homemade sort of pamphlet or newsletter, he had gotten someone's attention. At least that's what I recall. Is that how you remember it, or am I misthinking?
No, that's exactly right. What happened was he created this group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau and put out this regular newsletter, just like a typed, old typewriter, stapled, etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly. Gray Barker, I think, was one of the people on a subscription of that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And what happened was that the IFSB actually took off hugely, and he had hundreds and hundreds of followers and subscribers all around the world. And this was even more mysterious to the readers, because after the group was up and running, and he put out a number of issues of the journal, he suddenly said, I'm quitting. I'm leaving it all behind me. He said, I know what the truth is, and I'm not able to tell you. I'm gone. And people like Barker and several of his other friends realized that there was far more to it than he was willing to admit. Now, at the time, Bender told Barker and a few other friends that he'd been threatened by these three guys in black suits. He didn't elaborate on the fact that they supposedly materialized through the walls or had these shining eyes. He just left it as that, three guys in black suits. So Barker and the rest of the group assumed that, well, they must have been from the FBI or the CIA, because the guys back then, you know, wore suits and fedora hats. And Bender essentially didn't argue with that because he just really didn't want to get too further involved. But Barker, Gray Barker, as a writer and a researcher and someone who was sort of known for, you know, turning a good story into a great story by adding atmosphere and changing a few facts here and there, you know, he was almost like what you would call like a gonzo writer, you know, Hunter S. Thompson, where you read the story and you think, well, hang on, how much of this is true and how much is elaborated on for the benefit of the reader. So, you know, Barker's work does kind of fall into that category. But in 1962, after years, literally almost a decade after he left ufology after being threatened by these men in black, he came back only because Barker was constantly pushing him to write his own story, which he actually did, which was called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which was published in '62. Now, even Barker was surprised by Bender's story because it was very much like a cross between, you know, the X-Files meets, again, H.P. Lovecraft. It was like almost like a gothic occult type story, but with UFO overtones attached to it. And then from the 60s onwards, you had people like John Keel, who was investigating the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant between 66 and 67. And Keel found that numerous Mothman witnesses had been encountered by the Men in Black, Nick, and had been threatened. Nick. And just like Bender's Men in Black, they were sort of described as looking weird and strange. They were typically very pale. They wore these wraparound sunglasses which seemed to hide these bulging eyes. They didn't seem to fully understand our mannerisms. When offered food or liquid, they just kind of stared at it as if they didn't even understand what it was. And so what we have was an assumption in the 50s that the Men in Black were from the government, which was an assumption that continued for years and still does. But then when you dig into the story further, you find that most of the cases do fall into this weirder category that people like Bender and John Keel and Brad Steiger and various other researchers came to find was the dominating factor in the MIB story.
I just want to ask if I can just jump in for a moment about the Bender case, because it's very intriguing to me, Nick, where Bender originally in 1951 tells Barker and I guess his followers that what he encountered was basically a little bit more conventional in ways that they would accept, you know, guys in dark suits. But in you're saying in his book from 1962, he really did describe it in a much more paranormal manner. So that, and it's in this version that they, as it were, floated through the wall, I guess is how you're describing it.
Yes, and you know, Bender didn't lie to Barker and his friends. He basically just didn't tell the whole story. You know, he technically was correct when he said to his friends, I was visited by these three guys in black suits, which is true. Yeah. But, you know, he could have elaborated on it to a much greater degree. But I think part of the reason was that he really, he was terrified to the degree that he walked away and he really didn't want anything more to do with the subject. Now, as I said, he came back in '62, wrote the book, and briefly promoted it, you know, as an author's supposed to do for the publisher. And then he came back very briefly once or twice to give a couple of lectures around '67 and '68. Then after that, up until the time of his death at the age of 94 in 2016, he had nothing else to do with ufology. And what he actually did when he quit ufology, he was a big fan of the composer Max Steiner. And for people who don't know who Max Steiner is, he actually did the musical score, among many others, but he did the original musical score for the original King Kong movie in 1933. And so that's what he put his heart and soul into, running the Max Steiner Appreciation Society. And as I said, lived not too far from LAX airport and lived to 94 and never looked back at ufology. He really did quit it.
Please hang up. Try again.